Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 122 of the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, Ben Eagle. Today, we're discussing Henry Dimbleby's long-awaited National Food Strategy, which was published last week. DEFRA commissioned Mr. Dimbleby to conduct an independent review to help the government create its first National Food Strategy for 75 years. The strategy is available to read at nationalfoodstrategy.org, and I recommend you go and take a look at it there, as there's lots of recommendations in the report that we won't have time to cover today, so go over there at your leisure. However, we are going to focus on some of the key recommendations, and to do all this, I'm really thrilled to be joined today by Sue Pritchard, CEO at the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission, and Stuart Roberts, Hertfordshire farmer and Deputy President of the NFU. Welcome to you both. Thanks so much for coming on.
No problem, Ben.
Great to see you both. Sue, let's start with you. Big question to start with. Why do we need a national food strategy in the first place?
Well, it's a really, really good question. Perhaps the question is, why the heck haven't we had a national food strategy for 75 years? Government produces national strategies all of the time on really important issues. And the absence of a strategy for food, when it is such a foundational part of our economy and all human life, has been a really, really significant absence. Our lovely friend Tim Lang would say the government strategy has been to leave it to Tesco's, is a phrase he's well known for. And so this is, I think, a really important moment when government is recognising the real critical importance of food and food systems, the broadest definition of food and food systems, as central to our economy and to our communities.
Okay. Stuart, your thoughts? Do you welcome the report?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think, as Sue said, it's long overdue. I think we've, as government or even as wider society, we've delegated our responsibility for feeding a nation to the food supply chain and ultimately to retailers, as Sue touched on. And I think actually what this has done is it's acted as a really good moment in time for us all to assess where our food comes from, what are the values associated with that food. There's some challenging questions in some of what Henry says, but there's also some really big opportunities. And I think for me, probably more than anything, it shows the joined upness in lots of this. So he touches on trade policy, he touches on long-term agricultural support, but then he also touches on how we feed ourselves, the nutrient density, different types of food, and some of the big challenges, whether that be around unhealthy foods, balanced diet, or opportunities for fruit and veg. I think it's a really good report, but we should remember this is only one component that will go into the government's white paper. That's the key here is what government come out with later in the year in their white paper, of which Henry's report will clearly be a big piece of evidence into that report.
Super. I mean, let's dig into some of the detail now, and we'll start with one that has had quite a bit of media interest over the last few days, the proposed sugar and salt reformulation tax, which recommends a £3 per kilo tax on sugar and a £6 per kilo tax on salt used in processed foods or in restaurants and catering businesses. Sue, your thoughts on this?
We do need fiscal measures to help rebalance what Henry describes as a pretty dysfunctional food system. And we all know that getting the right fiscal measures in place is difficult and controversial. Some of the pushback to the report from the sector has demonstrated this. But as Henry would say, he worked through the range of potential fiscal measures with Treasury and with business and arrived at these two as the ones least likely to cause unintended consequences. And if you like, they're the kind of gateway fiscal measures into all of the other things that we are going to need to do to rebalance our current food system and get it working more for climate, for nature, for health, and for viable farm businesses. So, they're not perfect. Of course, they're not perfect, but I think they are really important. And I do think it opens up the conversation that we all need, which is how do we pay for the critical changes that we need, that we all agree are necessary? It would be such a shame if we end up at a place where we've been before, frankly, where we kind of all agree on the analysis of the current state, the current problems, but everything falls down when it comes to the questions, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to line up behind and do? So I think these are, in fact, moderate suggestions that they've been worked through with Treasury, then they're not as radical as I think they could have been. And it's going to be a real test now of the sector to see the extent to which they are prepared to get behind the radical and practical measures that we need.
Okay, let's turn towards some of the recommendations that are perhaps more directly linked to farming. Another recommendation is to guarantee the budget for agricultural payments until at least 2029. To help farmers transition to the new system, which would mean maintaining it at its current level of 2.4 billion in real terms. Currently, it's guaranteed until 2024. I'm assuming that you would welcome this, Stuart.
Very much so, and I think it's really the principle that underlies it, and you can say 2029, you could pick any number in the future. The reality is what we need is long-term commitments to agricultural funding, in the same way as we need long-term commitments to agricultural policy and arguably food policy, because we're not running a factory where I can alternate between one product one day and another day. It's a long-term industry. And I think that the real worry is we end up in this horrible cycle that we're having a big debate about the agriculture budget every single time there's an election. And we can't have that. We are very long-term businesses. And if we want to make particularly those long-term structural changes that touched on here, we need certainty. And I think that's something that is very welcomed in Henry's report, and certainly something that we would clearly endorse. And we can always have an argument about it being even longer, but the reality is he set down a really good marker there, I think, and one that is very, very helpful.
Yeah. So you were nodding along to Stuart's answer there. Do you think why do you think it was important to actually include this aspect within the report?
Well, we have 9 growing seasons left before 2030, by which time, if we haven't taken some really serious actions for climate and nature, it will be too late. And so supporting farmers to do the things that they need to do to facilitate that transition over the next 10 years seems to me to be a really important signal that we recognise that farmers are absolutely and centrally part of the solution to the climate nature crisis, as well as the public health crisis. Yeah, and the resources are part of it, the money is part of it, keeping the money in the food and farming system is important. But the other thing that I think is really important to signal and restate over and over again is the version of the future that we are all working together for. And there's quite a lot in Henry's reports, I think, to give us confidence that we are starting to line up behind priorities for food and farming, which will start taking the actions we need to avert the disaster that we will face if we do not.
I want to talk about recommendation 9, which is to create a rural land use framework. And I know actually, so there's quite a lot of work that the FFCC has done along this these sorts of terms. But so this would, in theory, set out which land should be used for conservation, for wilding elements, which for high grade farmland, and which for economic development and housing. Just playing devil's advocate a bit, is this not an example of top down government going too far, Stuart?
I think there is a danger with this sort of approach. The reality is how I see farming, and certainly how our members and my colleagues and friends of mine who are farmers see this, is every single one of us is delivering components that are contributing to climate change, components that are contributing to food production, components that are contributing to biodiversity. So I'm very much in that camp of land sharing. And actually in all farms, in all parts of the country, we need to be looking at how we get the most out of all 3 of those components. And look, on any individual farm, you will you will be on a spectrum. But I don't think there is any farm in the country where we can't be doing something on climate change and biodiversity. And equally, I don't think there's any farm in the country where we can't be doing an element of food. And I think it's about how we blend those rather than some great, colour by numbers approach, which is this bit of land is in this place and therefore must be used for that. I want to see how we can get the most out of it, both in terms of how it delivers for the rural economy and the rural community, but also for climate change, biodiversity, and the environment. And it's how we blend all of those. And unfortunately, I think it is more complicated than just here's the plan.
Yeah. Sue?
I completely agree. I'm quite conflicted about this recommendation because, of course, we have been doing this work for 3 years now, and calling for a land use framework to help mediate these really complex and contested decisions. But we have never advocated a top-down mapping exercise. Of course, those debates need to be had, but I am a firm believer that so much government policy is utterly undermined if civil servants get too attached to the idea that the map is somehow the territory. It just isn't. And I think Stuart made the point absolutely clearly that the kind of range of things that every farm can do, every land manager, every land holding can do for nature, for food, and for the other things that we require of land is going to depend very much on place, on citizens' interests, and also on the way that land is going to have to change to meet the climate and nature crises. Stuart knows better than most the pressures on water we're facing, not enough of it in the east, too much of it in the west, where I live, although not today, it has to be said, in the sunshine. And so this has to be an incredibly dynamic, relational conversation with people on the land. The rubber hits the road in places and in communities. So the work that we've been doing at FFCC is with pilots, one in Devon, one starting in Cambridgeshire, which is about working from the ground up, how principles, overarching and broad principles for land use can be applied in reality on the ground. And I think that's the really, really important work. I'm less as attracted as I am to maps. I love a map as much as the next closet geographer. The reality of this stuff is what happens on the ground in communities, and that's what I think we need to focus on.
Another point that certainly the wider media has picked up on a lot, and it's old news because it's something that we've all talked about a lot for a long time now, but it is this emphasis on fruit and veg production and less meat consumption. What could that mean for farming? Big point here, Stuart.
No, first of all, I am getting slightly cheesed off actually with people mixing up production and consumption. So for starters, we are seeing people's consumption changing, okay? And that will happen, and people will choose to eat what they will choose to eat. But actually, we have some of the most sustainable livestock systems in the world in this country. What we ought to be doing is producing as much as we can here with these systems to displace the unsustainable systems that are elsewhere in the world. Now, that's a production discussion, which I'm interested in as a farmer. The one I really want to flag up, though, and you touch on it there, is actually, first of all, that doesn't necessarily mean that reductions in consumption in one place will lead to reductions in production, because actually we should be producing where we can. But on fruit and veg, I get unbelievably excited. Sue described herself as a closet geographer. As she well knows, I'm a closet hydrologist. And one of the things I find fascinating, and actually, look, I think Henry's report is fascinating. I think one area he's probably missed is water. I don't think there's enough in there about water.
Okay.
We have huge potential in this country for growing more fruit and veg if we invest in it, if we prioritize it. And yeah, we should be consuming more fruit and veg. We all know that as consumers, we know we're not eating enough fresh fruit and veg. But my word, we should be producing more of it with the soils we've got, with the climate we've got, not importing it from some very, very unsustainable sources when it comes to water. So I really worry that we mix up this production and consumption, and what we should be doing is, what is it we can most sustainably produce in this country? Well, actually, with our ability to grow forage, with our ability to grow cellulose and convert that cellulose into nutrient-dense protein, we ought to be doing that. And I think we have a moral duty to do that in this part of the world, not elsewhere where they can't do it sustainably. And equally, that we should be prioritizing fruit and veg where we've got a climate that should allow us to do that.
So,
I mean, completely agree. This is quite boring, isn't it, Stuart?
I was going to say this.
But I absolutely agree. And I think where I might build on that is that one of the recommendations that Henry makes is around community food plans, community resilience. There is, I think, a really strong case to be made for strengthening shorter supply chains, local supply chains, so that where we are growing more fruit, veg, pulses, meat and dairy from sustainable sources, that is provided for through procurement, through local procurement, using the anchor institutions in those places for communities. That's the kind of, if you like, the natural progression of the comments that Stuart's making there about doing more of what we can, taking more responsibility as a country for producing what is ecologically sustainable for us to do so, and eating that too. So making sure that the supply chains, the value chains are in place to make that happen.
We'll obviously wait and see how much of this is actually transferred into the white paper. But let's assume that most of it is, just for a minute. How might this sit alongside trade policy, perhaps using the recent Australian trade deal as an example, Stuart?
Look, I think this is where Henry is bang on the money in the report. We've talked, Sue's talked, lots of us have talked. I think, Ben, you and I have done a different podcast on this issue before.
Yeah.
We cannot be driving our standards in this country ever further higher and then undermining that with what we do in trade deals. It's why the TAC is so important, and it's really good to have Henry, who clearly is pretty close to government on some of this, reinforcing those points in spades. And I think it's a real highlight in the report that actually he hasn't done the convenient thing, which is just ignoring that bit and not being controversial. He has put a very clear marker down that, you know, if we as a modern society have a set of values, have a set of rules that guide us, then they absolutely have to apply to product we import from elsewhere in the world. We can't just ignore that and allow people to offshore their consciences.
Big question, Anne. Difficult question to answer in many ways, but how do you think the report's likely to go down with many of the listeners to this podcast, with farmers? Sue?
So the farmers that I'm speaking to really, really welcome it. I think all of us can bring a degree of supportive criticality to some aspects of it, to say could have gone further, could have done more. But it's a massive report. And I know the intention is that the analysis is strong and really rigorously undertaken, and the recommendations are straightforward. The recommendations are easily achievable for a government that's committed to taking these kinds of actions. So there are lots of places where I think some farmers of my acquaintance, in fact, I had a call from one just before we started the podcast saying, but we could have gone further on the meat arguments, in fact. But it's from my point of view, it is a really, really strong start to framing the conversations that we need to be having more of.
Stuart, do you think it's going to go down well?
I think in part. So I think if you read the entire report and look at every part in it, then actually there's some really, really helpful stuff there. I think there are some bits that he's missed. I think this bit about different types of meat, I think, unfortunately, it doesn't pull out different systems. It just has that classic meat bad, plant good. And I've done him a disservice, but effectively that's how it's presented. And I think that for me is a massive missed opportunity. I think we could have started to talk about different production systems, the more sustainable ones we've got. And I do think on water, it's a missed opportunity. Now, these are all things that could be fed into the white paper. So it's not that they've disappeared, but I think they're the things. But there is also some stuff, particularly on trade and on funding that we've touched on this call, that will absolutely be supported by an agriculture sector. So, yeah, I think overall there's some really good bits. It's a curate's egg, isn't it? There's some good bits, there's some bad bits. But I think even the bits that I disagree with or take a different emphasis on, he's halfway there on it. So actually on the meat one, it's actually, let's separate production consumption. Let's get into different systems. And I think it's just a shame there's a missed opportunity there, probably more than anything.
And you insinuated to it there, but ultimately, it's the big question is how much of this is translated to a white paper. What extent does Henry Dimbleby have the ear of Boris Johnson, and how much does it matter, really? Stuart, I'm going to bounce that back to you.
Look, I would not wish to cast any judgment on who doesn't have the ear of Boris Johnson. What I do know is this is probably an important document feeding into the white paper, but it's only one of a number of pieces of evidence. There'll be the stuff that comes out of Sue's own work. There's stuff that the Food and Drink Sector Council are doing. There will be a massive wide range, but this is clearly one important component. And we all look forward, I suspect, to engaging more in the white paper and seeing what comes out of that later in the year.
And Sue, a final word from you.
Stuart's absolutely right. Again, I'm in my experience, politicians take their leadership from the strength of the voices that are talking to them. And if we, across sectors, across the country, across different interest groups and perspectives, can line up behind the really critical parts of this report, and as Stuart says, many others like it, then I think that will give government the confidence to act. That's our big job now for the next few months.
Super. What a discussion. That is all we have time for. But a massive thank you to my guests today, Sue Pritchard and Stuart Roberts. Stuart will actually be back on the show in a couple of weeks. So join us then for that. But before then, have a fantastic week, everyone.